So what did we talk about last time? We started with classes, and we mentioned that classes are, you can think of them as a superset of structures. So in addition to data members, we also have functions, right? And we mentioned that when we have functions and data members inside the function, typically we can split them into two groups. One group is referred to as the private, and the other group is the public. What was the difference between the two? Now let's be more specific. Public, it means that those attributes and those functions can be accessed from main through the object's name. And private, it means that only the class functions can get access to them. So today what we're going to do, before we move on, we're going to write a simple example to illustrate this. So a typical example would be a student. Let's just keep it simple. Keep the door open, please. Keep the door open, please. A typical example would be a student class, and in the student class we're going to have student name, student ID. Let's keep it simple to start with. And then we're going to have a number of functions like set name, set ID, get name, get ID, and so forth. And then we'll make it a bit more complicated. We're going to introduce a new topic which is called constructors. We briefly talked about constructors before, but today we're going to look at the details of constructors. And then maybe we can add another attribute to the student, make it a bit more fancier if you wish, to have a vector of courses, okay? And then we'll see how to set the courses, how to delete courses, and so forth. Okay, so let's start a new project. Okay, so for the time being, we're writing the class header and the main inside the same file. But as we mentioned later on, I'm going to show you how to split those in separate files. Okay, so just as includes, I'll increase the font in a minute. iStream. And we need string. And at one point, we're going to need a vector. Okay. So we start with the keywords class. Class names, by the way, usually they start with an uppercase, okay? It's not a syntax error if you make it lowercase, but this is the convention. So it's not a rule, it's a convention, it's a good practice. Okay, so to make sure that we don't forget the semicolon at the end, let's just include it now. Okay, so now we agreed that we have two parts. We can have a public part, and we can have private. In the private, usually your data members, all the data members will go inside the private. There's a reason for this. We mentioned that later on. I'm going to show you that even if you change the class implementation, this will not affect main. So all the code that you write in main remains as is, even if you change the data types. So instead of having a student major as a C++ string, if you change it to a C string, your code that you wrote in main would remain as is. Okay, but we need time to introduce this, so this is coming. For the time being, you have to understand that it's a good practice to have all your data members as a private in the class. Hence, they cannot be used in main directly, but they can be accessed through functions. So let's have, simple ID, string name. You want to have it as a full name, or we can have it as first name, last name, or as a full name. It's not a big deal for the time being. Well, if you wish, this is first name and last name. Yes.
We must always have private and the public, or we can just have a private and neglect public.
You can have public all the way. It's untypical to have private all the way. Now, if you have private all the way, then it means that even the functions are not accessible by main. So you can have public all the way, or you can mix public and private, but the best practice is to mix public with private and make sure that your data members are inside the public part. Okay, so now later on we're going to add courses, and we're going to make this a vector of string. Okay. Now let's think about the functions that we need for the student. Typical function would be to set the value of the ID, set the value of the first name, set the value of the last name. Typical function would be to get the value of the ID, get the value of the first name, get the value of the last name. Collectively, they refer to those as the set functions and the get functions. Typically, for each member that you have, for each attribute, for each data member you have in the class, you have to have a corresponding set and get functions. Okay, so we're going to have a method which is called setID. This is a void function, it does not return anything, and we have to pass it a value of the ID. And we need void set first name, and we pass it a string my first name, and we also need for the last name and set last name. Okay, so now inside main, instead of, so later on in void main, when we have a student type, instead of saying std1.id is equal to 1, now this is not acceptable because the ID is private. But what we can do instead is to set the value of the ID. So we can call the function instead. We can say std1.setID, and you pass it the number that you wish. Okay, so now we don't have direct access to the data members, but we can access them through functions. Okay, again, do we have to do this? No, you don't. If this was part of public, then you don't need to do this. You can directly access the ID, but as we mentioned, this is best practice in object orientation. Okay, so now we have set. In the same way, we're also going to need get. So for each attribute, we have get ID, we have get first name, and we have get last name. Do we need to return anything from this function? What do we need to return from this function, get ID? The ID itself. What's the type of the ID? So what's the return type? So this is integer, and the over here it's and string as well. Okay, so typically for each attribute you need a set method and you need a get method. Okay, so now let's assume that we want to print out the student ID. So we can no longer do this now because the ID is private. I don't know if you can see it, but next to ID over here there is a lock. Can you see the lock? Which means that it's not accessible from main. It's part of the private data members of the class. So what we cannot do now, we cannot do this. We cannot see out the student ID. But what do we do instead? Sorry? What do we do? Get ID. Dot get ID, yes. Now this will return the ID and then we can just safely print it out. Okay, let's go back. So what other functions can you think of? So now we have set and get for all of them. What else? Not yet, we'll come back to the vector in a minute.
Adding course names.
Still the vector over here, it's commented out, right? So but we're going to do that later on. For the time being, we can print out the whole information of the student, right? So let's have a void function called print info, if you wish. That's it, right? And then in the implementation of this, I'm going to show you how to access all the data members and print them out. But it's printing out information, so it's not returning anything. So it's a void function. You can, if you wish, have one sort of a big set function that will set all the attributes for the student at once. But this is optional. So if you have a function called setInfo, for instance, and then you pass it integer ID, and you pass it string first name, and you pass it a string last name. So instead of calling 3 functions individually, you can just do it at once. Okay? So now we can set all the attributes individually, or we can set them at once. We can get the individual attributes, or we can just print them out all at once. Okay? We did not create constructors yet. We'll talk about constructors in a minute. Now up to this point, do you have any questions? No questions? Let's move on. So now what do we have to do next? We have to implement those methods. We did not implement them yet, right? So we've only declared the methods. Now we need to implement the methods. How do we implement the methods? You remember, we have to start with the function name, with the class name, right? Okay, so let's take a copy of all of those because we need to implement all of them. Of course, later on we'll be doing this in a separate file, but for the time being, this is our starting point. Okay. So all of those, they need to be implemented. Okay. So we have to, what is this called? What's this operator called? The scope resolution operator. This says that the setID function, it belongs to this class. Okay. So now the name of the function, if you wish, you can refer to it as a one unit. There's a function called setID, and it comes from a class which is called the student class. This is what it means. Okay. Now this is important because you can have another function which is called setID, but it doesn't belong to the student class. It belongs to a course class. Courses can have IDs as well, right? So as long as you quantify the course name, as long as you proceeded with its scope, you're on the safe side. So now this is saying that std setID, it's coming from the scope of the student class. Now we need to implement this. This is a very simple implementation, right? What do I write over here? So let me just squeeze it in the first same line. So just simply say, what shall I type in? So why did he say see out enter ID, and it's already passed as a parameter? So what shall I write in? Ask the user for the ID. Why would I ask the user for the ID? Why do I need to set see out the ID if this function is called setID? We just have to see in. Why do we have to see in if we are passing the ID as a parameter? Why would I return the ID if this is a void function? Pass it the address of what? Thank you. ID is equal to my ID. Can you see how complicated this is? Where is this ID coming from? It's from the class. And where is this ID coming from? The parameter, right? This is how we called it, setID, and we passed it the ID1. So now the ID1 is stored inside ID. Now, there's something simple, it's intuitive. Maybe I don't need to mention it, but some students, they make this mistake. This ID, C++ will look at this ID and it say, just a minute, this ID is not declared anywhere. But it will know that this ID, it belongs to this scope resolution. So immediately when it sees ID, it will go to this class and it will search for its declaration. If it finds it, then it's on the safe side. You can continue, there is no compilation error. So at this point, some students will make the following mistake. There is no such thing. First of all, student is not the name of the object. Student is the name of the class. What's the name of the object? std1. And anyway, over here we don't have access to std1 because std1 is declared inside main. So no, you just simply mention ID, and immediately C++ will know that this ID is coming from this class. So there is no compilation error. Then where is this my ID coming from? It's as a parameter, right? And from main, where is it coming from? 1, right? So there's no syntax error as well. Those are small details. They're quite obvious, but I have to mention them because some students, they get confused at this point. Okay. Now let's set the first name. What shall I type in? What shall I type in? First name equals my first name. Oh. Scope resolution. But now without the scope resolution, C++ it found a variable called ifName. It does not know that it belongs to the class. ifName is not declared inside the function implementation, so obviously it's a syntax error. But now when we specify that this ifName is coming from this class, then the problem should disappear, right? So now we have first name is equal to, but we're keeping it simple, guys, right? For the ID over here, for instance, we want to make sure that the ID is not less than 0, the ID is not out of range if there's a specific range. So, but now we're just keeping it simple to understand the concepts. Okay. And we need to do the same thing for the set. So this is a replication now. But instead of first name, we have last name. Okay. Now what do we do with this function? Again, we have to specify that this is coming from the student class. What shall I type in? ID equals my ID. First name equals my first name, and last name equals my last name. Should pass it here as my last name. Right? Are we done? Let's align them if you wish to look nicer. Okay. Get ID, what shall I do? First of all, we have to say that this is coming from the student class. And then for the implementation, what do you suggest? But why did they say cout and this function returns an integer? Return ID. Okay. Get first name, this is student. Class, what do we return? First name. And then likewise student, and what do we return? Last name. Right? Okay, we're nearly done. Now we have one last function, which is the print student information. This is a void function, right? So obviously now we need to do cout, so it's not returning anything. So what do I cout? Cout ID, first name, last name, yes sir. The function. Set info.
It's optional, right?
It's optional, yes. Unless you're asked to do it, then it's not optional. Okay. So what we're going to print out over here is the ID of the student. ID, and then followed by ID, and then maybe \n, and then
So right now the student dot ID or just ID?
first name. I'll come back to that question. Good question. And then we have first name, and then we repeat this again for the last name, last name and a name, and we're done. \n. That's it. Okay. Now we have to specify that this belongs to the student class. So now there are no syntax errors. What's your question again? Do we write ID or
the student.id or just ID?
student.id or just ID. طيب. هلا we addressed this before, but it's fine. Let me answer it again. What's the name of the class and what's the name of the object?
Class is student, the object is student.
طيب. Now usually you access the functions and the attributes through the objects, not through the class. And later on we're going to talk about static members. Forget about those for a minute. For the time being, we can only access attributes and functions through the object name, not through the class name. So obviously I cannot say student.id because student is the name of the class, not the name of the object. So what do you suggest?
We cannot also write
We cannot write std1 because std1 is already declared in main, it's not declared over here. But again, now this is a repetition. C++, when it sees a variable called ID, it will search for the declaration locally. So it will say, is there something called ID over here? So this is a question that C++ will ask. But the answer is no, right? So the second question that C++ will ask is, this ID, does it belong to this class? Then immediately it will jump to that class and search for ID. Does it find it? Then that's it. It will stop there. So there is no need to precede this with the class name, and there is no need to precede it with the object name, and it doesn't work that way anyway. Okay? Guys, this is an important point. I know that some students, they get confused with this when they start with classes. The attributes of the class, ID, first name and last name, they are directly accessible by all the functions of the class without preceding them with the dot. The names of the attributes are directly accessible by the functions of the class without preceding them with the class name, without preceding them with the object name. Okay? In fact,
why should we declare the functions in the other part?
Why should we declare the functions?
I mean, implement them in the other part. It said it should be in the other.
No, forget about that. That's called separate compilation. We'll talk about that later on. Don't worry about it now. Can we implement a function inside the class? The answer is yes. You can implement a function inside the class, but I don't want to talk about it now. We'll talk about it later on. For the time being, so we're going to have the class and then separate implementation. Can we implement the function inside the class? Yes, we can, but later on. Okay. For the time being, we have to understand the way that we are laying it out using the scope operator. Any questions up to now? Yes.
You said attributes of class can be that without the dot we can access them, but why is that?
Why is that?
Yes.
Because all of those, last time we talked about the concept of encapsulation. Encapsulation means that we have the functions and the attributes under one roof. Since they are under one roof, then you can just simply have access to them. Okay?
So will there be an error if we write student.id?
Yes. No, it will be an error. Because you cannot access a member through the class name. You access a member through the object name, unless it's static, and we're not going to talk about this now. For the time being, you cannot access an attribute through the name of the class. You can only access an attribute through the name of the object, or you can access the attribute directly through the functions of the same class. Okay, so now let's go to main. And let's have two students. So we have student 1 and we have student 2. Now, of course, at this point, we don't have to have student 1, student 2. We can have an array of students, right? But I don't want to complicate it for the time being because I want you to understand the concepts. But we can do this. How do we declare an array? Can we do something like this? What does this mean? This means that we have an array of 10 students, just like we can have integer array size 10. So we declared an array of 10 students. Okay, but for the time being, let's simplify it because I wanted to understand the concept. So we have student 1 and student 2. Okay, now we can do whatever we want with student 1 and student 2. So student 1 dot set info. So this is student ID now 100, and the first name is and volunteers Jad, and the last name is also Jad. So this is Jad. And we have student 2 dot set info and student ID 200, and then we have safe and last name Ali. So now we have safe and Ali together. So now we have 2 students and we set the information. What we can do, we can also print out the information to make sure that it was correctly stored inside the class. So we can say student 1 dot print info. Do I need to pass it any arguments? No, because the arguments are already stored inside the class, right? So where will the arguments come from? Where will the name at this point? Where will the name and the ID come from? They're coming from this object, right? The name and the IDs are already stored inside std1. So this function, which is print information, will have access to the ID, to the first name, and to the last name. And likewise, we can also print std2 dot print information, and that's it. Let's compile and run. Start without debugging. Ignore that, it's specific to this version of Visual Studio that I'm using. Okay, so let's run without debugging. So now, just simply print it out the first student and the second student. So student ID 100, first name Jad, 200, and Saif Ali.
How can you get rid of this? Because it's also on this version, which is the new one.
Sometimes you get the same error.
Yes. No, I got the same version.
So what I did is the following: you just right click on the name of the project, and then you go to properties, and then there is linker. You go to general, incremental linking. By default it's yes, you just change it to no.
What does that mean?
There is a batch that you can download to fix this error, but I thought this error is not there in the latest version of Visual Studio. I'm sure it's not there in the latest version of Studio, so you don't have to worry about it. I think when you create an object, when you create the project, there's one option that says empty project, and there's another option that says pre-compiled headers. Just uncheck that, and I think you will not get the error. I'm not sure, but anyway, if you get this error, those are the steps to solve it. Okay, so any questions up to this point regarding the classes? So we kept it simple, but now we have to introduce something called the constructors. We briefly talked about constructors before, but now let's look at the details. It would be nice if at this point, when we declared the student, to say that those are the information that I want to store inside the student, 1, and it would be nice if we can also do this. And hence, for the time being, just let's ignore the set information functions. Now, we should not be surprised by this notation, because previously we have looked at something like this, integer I. Do you remember? It means that we're going to initialize the value of I with this number, yeah? So now we can do the same thing, but we have to implement those functions. So we can say that when you declare the functions, we're going to initialize it with the following values. So 100 obviously will go to the ID, this will go to the first name, and this will go to the last name, okay? Again, just like the case with primitive data types, if you do this, it's okay to do it in the declaration, but you cannot do it later on, right? So immediately this will give you a syntax error. So now we understand that if you use this notation, you can only do it when you declare your variable, but you cannot do it later on. So at the same line of the declaration, you can also initialize your variable. This applies to primitive data types. We mentioned that primitive data types are non-classes. So those are like character, integer, long integer, float, double, boolean, okay? All those are primitive data types. They're not built in classes. Okay. So now, fine, yes, this is acceptable as long as you write this function. This function, it has a name. It's called the constructor. The constructor has special arrangement, and it's declared differently. Okay. Now, the first thing we have to know about constructors is that usually, more often than not, the constructors are public. Okay. In CMP 1.2.20, you're not going to see a case where the constructor is private. Okay. The name of the constructor has to be the same as the name of the class. What's the name of the class? The name of the constructor has to be the same. Okay? The constructor cannot have a return type, not even void. So there's nothing that precedes the name student. It has to be the same name as the class, and it's going to be part of the public part of the class. In our case, we are passing it the same information as this, so I'm just going to copy it. Now we have a constructor. Great. We need to implement that constructor. So the name of the constructor is it comes from the student class, and what's the name of it? I can search for it over here. It has to be there. Again, there is no return type, not even void. And the name of the function is the same as the name of the class, and it's part of public. Right? So those are the three rules that we have to know for now. Do we have to pass it parameters? No, we don't. But this is just one example. We'll write more examples as we move on. So now what do we need to do? It's the same as this, right? In fact, I can, if I want, to call the function setInfo, but it's fine.
So can you explain the first one that wrote the constructors?
Okay, let's go back to main. If you want to initialize your object at the same line of the declaration, you need a special function which is called the constructor. The constructor has a number of rules. The rules are the following. The constructor is part of the public as far as CMP 220 is concerned. The name of the constructor is the same as the name of the class. Case sensitive, so if it's uppercase, it has to be uppercase as well. And the constructor does not return any value, not even void. So it's not preceded by anything. It's not preceded by return type. It's not preceded by void. Okay. And the same thing applies when you implement the function. The only difference between this and other functions are two things. It's not preceded by the return type, not even void, and it has the same name as the class. Okay. Alas, I think I repeated it enough times. Now we get it. Okay. Let's convince ourselves that this function is being called. So I'm going to have a breakpoint over here, and I'm going to have a breakpoint over here. Or maybe I just have one breakpoint and then step into debug, start debugging. Okay, so now we have this object. It's not initialized, the ID is not initialized, the first name, the last name, all of that is not being initialized. But now we're going to step into, which is F11. This is C++ stuff, so I can step out of it. Step into again, C++, step out, step in. Now we stepped in the function which is the constructor. Now look at the ID, it's 100, look at the first name, and look at the last name. All of them are coming from the initialization part. So we're going to set all of them, and we're going to return. What will happen next? The function will be called again, right? But it will be called again now for std2. So I'm going to step into. If it sends me inside C++, I can just step out, step into C++ again. So step out, step into, and here you go. Now let's look at the ID. It's 200, and save and array. So this is the second call of the constructor. Okay. So the constructor is called automatically, if you wish.
So do we need another function?
Still you need the print, right? But in this case, maybe the student changed the ID. So student.set ID to 101. Maybe, you know, for whatever reason, you can modify the first name, the last name. Very unlikely, but you can modify courses, right? So still you need the set and get, even if you have constructors. And in a typical class, you always have set and get for all the attributes, and you have more than one constructor, and you have the print information. What does it mean to have more than one constructor? As you know from CMP 120, we can override functions, right? Overriding functions means that you have the same function name, but a different list of parameters. So now we can also do this following. So I'm going to add std3, and I'm not going to initialize it. Student 1, student 2, and student 3. I'm not going to initialize it. However, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add something called the default constructor. The default constructor, this is how it looks like. It does not take any parameters. Okay? And the default constructor will be called in such cases. So now we have student 3, but we did not initialize it, right? So if you create an object without initializing it, the default constructor will be called. In fact, let's start by student 3 over here, because we're going to debug it in a minute. So student 3, student 3, comma. So again, now if you create an object without initializing it, the default constructor will be called. But now we need to implement the default constructor as well. So we can do the following. No parameters, right? So now we can just simply set the ID to -1. Instead of having a bad pointer over here, we can have an empty first name and an empty last name. Does this look like a reasonable initialization to you? It does, right? Student ID -1, empty name, empty last name. Very reasonable. Okay. So now let's have a breakpoint over here and run the program again. So again, this is called the default constructor. The default constructor is a constructor that does not receive any arguments, and it's called automatically whenever you declare an object without initializing it. Let's debug. Step into. Did you see that? Immediately it jumped to the default constructor. For which object? For the first one, just student 3. Okay. And then it's going to initialize it and return. And now look at student 3. Immediately you see that the ID is -1, first name is empty, last name is also empty, because the default constructor was called. Do we need to do this for the default constructor? It skipped the function call, right? So let's go back. Just totally skipped it. Can you see it? It's not initialized. Typically you don't do this unless you have something to pass. So for the default constructor, you just declare the object as if you're declaring integer I, no parentheses, and automatically the default constructor will be called. Okay, so now we have the default constructor, and you've also noticed that if you remove the default constructor, you'll have an error. So let's remove the default constructor. I'm going to comment it out and comment out the default constructor. And now immediately you'll see that there's an error over here. What does it say? No default constructor exists. So which means that if you create a non-default constructor, you have to create a default constructor. You can get away without creating constructors altogether. You can get away with creating a default constructor only, but you cannot get away of creating a non-default constructor without a default constructor. Okay? So whenever you create constructors, make sure that you have a default constructor. The default constructor is a constructor that does not receive any arguments, and it's done for initialization purposes. Right. Now, what we can also do, there's a shortcut in constructors. You might like or you might not like, it's up to you. But the shortcut, it goes like this. Let me see if I can get the syntax correct. So we just simply say ID and then -1. And then I'm not sure if it's a comma. I'll double check. First name, and I'm going to give it the value, and last name, and I'm going to give it the value. Did I write it correctly? I think so. Yeah, this is how it looks like. So this is a shortcut that is typically used in constructors or in default constructors. You don't have to use it, but it's there in C++, and you have to be aware of it. And when you start writing constructors and classes, I prefer that you be more explicit about your code, but you have to be aware that this is there. So you can just use this notation to initialize all your variables. They are comma separated. They don't end up with a semicolon or anything, and they start with a colon over here. So this is how the notation look like.
Do we need the brackets if we do the short?
Yes, you need the brackets, because the brackets, it says that this is an implementation. This is an empty implementation. Yes. Bracket, it means that curly bracket. Close the curly bracket, it means that it's an implementation. Empty implementation is also acceptable.
So this constructor never returns anything.
Constructor does not return anything. A constructor has the same name as the class, and it's part of the public, not the private. Yes.
So why do we initialize it like that? Why don't we do it the previous way? Like, why do we have to have it ID -1 in bracket?
What do you suggest instead for the initialization?
Like inside the curly bracket.
Inside the curly brackets? You can do that. Both of them are the same. Those two are exactly the same. That was only a shortcut. Do you want to use it or not? It's up to you. But when you see it, you have to understand it. Okay? So this nicely brings us to the end of the lecture. Today, I'll answer your questions. Today in the lab, we're going to ask you to write I think it's a student class, and then a vector inside this. No, it's a structure about apartments. And then there's a vector inside it, or there's a vector of apartments. And then later on, we're going to ask you to write a student class introduction similar to what we did today. This lecture is recorded. I'm going to upload it to iLearn. You can watch it later on at your own time. Yes, Salma. Can we use cout inside the constructor? Yes, by all means. You can use cout inside the constructor. Typically, you do that for debugging purposes.
Okay.
Yeah?
So what happens now to student 3?